Concept 24.3 says hybrid zones reveal factors that cause reproductive isolation. As I mentioned, a lot of people like to think of species as being this clear, distinct black and white separation, like between a cat and a dog, between a bird and a human. But in reality, biology is all about living things, and so it makes it quite a bit more messy, and there's a lot more gray area. So we're going to look at what are called hybrids, which are when two separate species do interbreed and create a living offspring. It may not be a viable fertile offspring, but a living offspring of some kind. And we're going to look at something called hybrid zones, which are little areas, geographic areas that may have overlapping populations. So a hybrid zone is a region in which members of different species mate and produce hybrids. Hybrids are the result of mating between species with incomplete reproductive barriers. So this means that there are barriers, and these are two separate species, but that whatever that reproductive barrier is, whether it's biological or geographical, is not complete. So you have some overlapping portions here. This would be some of the gray areas that we were talking about. So a hybrid zone can occur in a single band where adjacent species meet. Oftentimes you have like a line, basically, that you might consider like a no man's land between the two species. And a good example they give in the textbook is two species of toad in the genus Bombina that interbreed in a long and narrow hybrid zone. And they kind of show a map of that. So this would be in Europe, and where the reddish orange is, that is the lower altitude habitat of the fire-bellied toad, Bombina bombina, and then the yellow areas here is the higher altitude habitat of the yellow-bellied toad, Bombina variegata. So these two are separate populations and separate species, but you notice this red line here on the map. That's where the two populations kind of meet, where you have, say, the more mountainous areas of the high altitude toad meeting the lower lands of the fire-bellied toad, and then you have a population overlap, and so you have a hybrid zone there. And when you look at this graph, what it shows is the frequency of alleles, a particular type of allele within one of the toads, one of the varieties of toads. You see how in the middle in this hybrid zone you have this kind of decline. So there's a particular allele that you find in the yellow-bellied toad, and if you go into the yellow-bellied toad range, you'll find that allele in almost all of them. If you go in the red-bellied toad range, you find that allele in almost none of them. But if you go in the middle, you get a middle answer because they are mixing the genetics. While there are many cases of different species being able to successfully breed together, so they wouldn't have any pre-zygotic barriers keeping them from breeding, there may be post-zygotic barriers because hybrids often have reduced fitness. In other words, they're usually perhaps not as strong, or they have poor survival and reproduction rates compared to their parent species, and so these hybrids often do not go on to pass on their own alleles to the next generation. Perhaps they are infertile, or perhaps they just don't live long enough to make it into adulthood. The distribution of a hybrid zone can be pretty complex. It's not always a nice straight thin line like we see here. Sometimes it's patches and pieces and parts, especially if the two zones of where the parent species live is kind of scattered, and within patches you'll have a wide variety of hybrid zones kind of mixed and matched as well. So it's not always a nice distinct little line where the two populations overlap. It can be a bit more complex than that. When we're looking at hybrid zones, these areas where the two populations meet and they interbreed, usually you have a couple of different outcomes. If you kind of watch these hybrid zones over time, you're either going to see something called reinforcement, fusion, or stability. Your book gives a good example using an illustration here. So we start out with a single population. The little blue dots here represent single population. You have gene flow amongst these, so they're all interbreeding, and you have gene flow between all three of these populations. And then, for some reason, we have some sort of barrier to the gene flow. Could be geographic separation, could be something more along the lines of sympatric separation of some kind, but for whatever reason there's a barrier to gene flow that occurs, and one population is sort of separated from the other two. Once that happens, you begin to have some divergence. So now that this population is separated, perhaps in a different habitat or something along those lines, you're going to have a bit of divergence. It's going to change over time. It's under different natural selection pressures and the like. These two continue on down their merry little path. Now the only thing I don't like about this chart is in actuality these will change over time as well, but they just leave them the same to kind of clarify. As time goes by, all these populations are going to change, but this just shows a greater divergence is what they're trying to say here. As it goes from the blue to kind of the pink, they're showing a divergence, a greater increase in genetic difference and the like. Now, there will be an area where perhaps they overlap, and you will have what's called a hybrid zone. And so sometimes one of these of the blue population breeds with the pink population, and you get a little purple offspring, a hybrid individual within this hybrid zone. There are three possible outcomes here. This path can continue to diverge greater and greater, and that would be reinforcement. So you are reinforcing this divergence between the two. Or you could have fusion. Perhaps these paths get closer and closer to where they eventually come back together again, similar to what you had at the beginning. Or you could have something called stability, where the paths basically straighten out and there's always a gap, but it remains kind of a stable gap in difference, and you always have kind of a hybrid zone of the same size. So those are your possibilities, and we'll briefly take a look at all three. The first possibility is called reinforcement, and that is strengthening the reproductive barriers. This happens if the hybrids are less fit than either one of the parent species. If being a hybrid, it makes you worse off for some reason than being either one of the parent species, over time you're going to see the rate of hybridization decrease. You're going to see the divergence between the populations continue, and eventually you will have basically no overlap or no hybridization. So if these paths continue to diverge, the hybridization zone is going to eventually get smaller and smaller and perhaps even disappear. If you're looking for reinforcement, you should find that reproductive barriers should be stronger for sympatric than allopatric species. So if you have two groups in the same area and you have reinforcement occurring, you should see reproductive barriers that grow stronger over time. And a good example in the textbook is a particular type of bird that the scientists were looking at called a flycatcher, where the males are more similar in allopatric populations, in populations that are separated by geography, than they are in sympatric populations. The textbook shows how if they were looking at two different populations of birds, two species of birds closely related to this European flycatcher, in sympatric populations where they lived in the same geographic area, the differences between the two types of males are very distinct, and the females will only choose the males that fit their description or fit their population, fit their species. So here you have a pied male and a collared male, and they live in the same area, but they look quite different, and that helps distinguish them basically. And the females rarely make a mistake. They choose the one that is of their same species. But if you look at the allopatric populations that are separated by geography, that don't live in the same area, well, the pied male and the collared male actually look a lot alike. And in this case, if you were to introduce a female of the collared variety to a male of the pied variety, it's likely that they would mate. They kind of make the mistake of choosing the species that is not their own. So you do have some mating occur. So this shows that reinforcement, where they are in the same area, they have strong differences, and those differences grow greater over time to prevent hybridization. And that's a good example of reinforcement over time. With the sympatric population, you should expect that there will be less and less interbreeding, and as you see here, there was none in this case. And so eventually perhaps you may have zero interbreeding and zero hybrids at all. The opposite of reinforcement would be fusion. So in that example, if we go back here and to look for fusion, we get to that slide. So fusion would be where there is greater gene flow between the two populations, and as a matter of fact, they basically eventually lose the hybrid zone, not because they are diverging away from each other, but because they actually rejoin and become a single population again, and then you have gene flow between them again, and so you would kind of define them as a single species or a single population. If the hybrids are as fit or as strong, as well suited for living as the parents, then eventually there can be substantial gene flow between the species, and you'll get to a point where if the gene flow is great enough, you won't even call them two separate species. They will have fused back together. So basically you could kind of think about this like speciation in reverse. In the textbook they go back to Lake Victoria where they were looking at those cichlid fish, and researchers think that because of mankind and some of our various polluting ways, that the pollution levels in Lake Victoria have increased to such a degree that the water is not nearly as clear as it once was, and that reduced ability for the female cichlid fish to see clearly and distinguish the males of their different species has started to cause a lot of interbreeding. So you have fusion, you have what once was easily separated distinct populations actually beginning to interbreed, and once you have that gene flow between the populations, you're having basically speciation in reverse. You have a fusion process going on. They show some pictures where here are the two individual species, and you can see they look fairly distinctly different, but if the water were murky it might be difficult to tell them apart, and there has been a rise in the number of these hybrids. They call them the turbid water hybrids. This is from areas where the water is turbid. In other words, it has a lot of sediment suspended in it. It's kind of dirty and cloudy and not easy to see. And so eventually you could have enough gene flow between these populations to where they all come out to look this way, or a greater number of them come out to be hybrids, and then you would just call them one particular species instead of being separated into the two. This also could be causing, this type of overlap could be causing fusion of many species, including polar bears. Polar bears are facing shrinking habitat ranges, so because of global warming and mankind's advancement into their areas, they have shrinking habitat ranges, and they tend to, in modern times, their habitat is overlapping more and more with grizzly bears of say further south, and so you have some fusion between these species, and you have grizzly bears coming into contact with polar bears more often. You have those growler bears that I was talking about. You could imagine eventually that there would be no distinct polar bears left, that they all might become hybrids or mixed in with the gene pool of the grizzly bears, and as a separate species the polar bears could eventually disappear. The third possibility for a zone where you have overlapping populations creating hybrids is called stability, and that would be the continued formation of the hybrid individuals. Many hybrid zones remain stable in a sense that there are a certain percentage of the creatures that are hybrids and they continue to be produced. In some cases this happens because the hybrids survive or reproduce better than either of the parents, or at least they have some particular advantage in certain areas or certain time frames. In other cases there is such a large amount of gene flow from outside the hybrid zone that it overwhelms the selection for increasing the isolation reproductively. So you may have just so many of the creatures in an overlapping range willing and able to mate with one another that there is always this population of hybrids that occurs and stays there. So stability would look more like this case right here, to where these lines stay apart and they still are two distinct populations, but there's always an area in between of the hybrid zone where you have a mixing of the two's genetics. Let's take one more break right there. Hybrid zones are interesting to study because they can help us understand what causes a population to diverge into two different species, or as a matter of fact what can even cause species to disappear and merge back into one another. And again, think about that, all those paint chips. It's not just black and white, it's a process. The problem is this process may take millions of years. So in your lifetime, in your 75 or 80 years on the planet, you don't get to see this process. You get to see a snapshot of this process in action in your time here on Earth. Now through our various means of science we can look backwards further in time, and we can even project into the future to some degree, so we can see a greater picture if you use the tools of science. We're going to take a break. We'll come back with Concept 24.4. That'll be our last one, and we'll be done.